So I'm not Tony Bai. I'm Noelle Vestal. I'm the compliance officer here at PreVeil, and I'm so excited to be able to talk with all of you about this really fantastic topic. So what we're talking about today is what you need to know about CMMC and NIST. This has been a conversation that we've had, many times, and definitely, today it's been a very big conversation. So I'm really excited for all of us to talk about it today. So really quickly, I'm going to introduce everybody. The actual Tony Bai, not the impersonator Tony Bai. Tony is a 27-year IT and 10-year cybersecurity professional with a range of certifications who is responsible for overseeing NIST-based engagements, including FedRAMP, FISMA, and 800-171, and providing cybersecurity advisory and guidance to clients. His background includes providing risk assessment for government agencies and Fortune 500 companies across multiple industries. Joe Chavarria, I want to make sure I'm saying your last name correctly.
Yep, you got it. Thanks.
Awesome. I'm so glad. Joe is the CEO of Total Cyber Solutions and a lifelong cybersecurity expert, retired U.S. Army veteran with over 25 years of experience and knowledge working in and leading red teams, security engineering, vulnerability assessments, pen testing teams, transforming commercial and federal standards through testing and data analysis. Joe has worked and managed in civilian, military, and federal environments, leading cybersecurity professionals in highly volatile, large-scale environments. So welcome, Joe. And last but certainly not least, Joe Verry. Over the past 21 years, John has guided thousands of organizations on their journey to become provably secure and compliant. I love the word provably there. That's a big one. John definitely mixes wit and wisdom while sharpening his deep knowledge of cybersecurity to both business and technical audiences as the host of the virtual CISO podcast. So welcome, John. So everybody, it's really wonderful to have all of you here today. Really looking forward to this conversation. So we have a couple of questions that we're going to go over, and I'm going to start with you, Tony number one, because I'm Tony number two today. We'll both be Tony. So Tony, if you could explain sort of, not necessarily at the highest level, but like slightly down from the highest level, the relationship between NIST 800-171 and CMMC level 2, and then also how DFARS 7012 sort of plays in with both of them.
Okay, sure. So, when CMC first came out under version 1, there were some changes or additions to 171. So 171 is the foundation for CMMC. So we all know that 800-171 is about protection of CUI in non-federal IT systems. It's about the confidentiality of that CUI data. Pretty much in layman's terms, corporate infrastructure, right? So you all have these all the vendors, contractors, they supply some sort of specific solution to the government or professional services, but sometimes that federal contract information or that controlled and classified info is housed or transmitted to them in some form of fashion. They house it in the systems that they use outside of the government services they're providing, right? So your HR systems, CRM systems, all that. That's what 171 is supposed to cover. Now, that's also what CMC is designed to cover, right? To protect our supply chain, to make sure all that data is properly protected for the DoD. What CMC was is they found, I'm sure you've heard throughout all these seminars too, that 171 self-attestation just didn't quite work out. So what CMC did was to provide a trust but verify using independent assessors. The first version, they did add additional things, realized that it's probably more, they're biting off more than they could chew at that point. So with version 2, they rolled it all back to the original 110 controls outlined in 171. Now, how DFARS comes into play here is with the interim rules that they released, what it did, it outlined what your typical standards are for cyber incident reporting and the DFARS and stuff, but it did call out the fact that you had to be compliant originally with 171. Now with CMC version 1, they rolled out that initial transition plan under there, and that's what the other clauses or the added clauses when they did the interim updates to 7012 added to for CMMC. The other clauses was to further refine how 171 needed to be implemented, mainly the DoD assessment methodology and uploading your score to the SPR system that they were talking about just in the prior panel, as well as outlining the differences of when the DIVCAC, the Defense Industrial Base, we'll see if I get this right, Cybersecurity Assessment Center, the DIVCAC,
Well done.
can perform what they call basic confidence, which is a self-attestation by the companies, or a medium or a high confidence where the DIDCAC actually performs some form of 171 assessment to validate the SPRS scores. And then gives them authority to come out and do an on-site assessment if they ever need to, right? So that's kind of how everything is all related back to 171. CMC is just the next version of how DoD wants to implement and validate. And the DFARS is just the rules that says this is why you have to do it in a contractual context.
That's perfect. No, that's a great way of explaining it, especially it's such a complex, there's such a complex inner workings with everything. And, you could technically be CMMC compliant and not be DFARS compliant, DFARS 7012 compliant at this point. But if you're not DFARS 7012 compliant, you're not compliant with your contract. There's a lot of confusion with all of this. So John, actually, if I could ask you, I know that we were just talking about 801.71 and Tony was discussing DFARS and that sort of thing. So the NIST 801.71 security requirements, well, one question, which is how long has that been required in contracts? And then the second, probably more important, conversation to have surrounding that is, why do you think it is that so many companies have sort of waited to do their 801.71 compliance?
So in terms of, it's been required, the 2016, December 2016, I believe 801.71 was originally introduced. I'm sure it was called for in contract shortly thereafter. So the good news is that with the move back to CMMV2, we're back to, it's all roads are back to the future, right? We're back exactly where we
Right.
started in 2016. And then in terms of why do people wait? Why do people procrastinate about everything, right? So a couple of things, clearly one of it is lack of resources, right? Many of the organizations that are in the DIB are smaller organizations. Implementing a comprehensive cybersecurity program like one that conforms with NIST 801.71 or CMMC V2 L2 takes some internal resources that very often they're constrained on. There's a lack of expertise that we see. NIST is wonderful guidance. It is open to a lot of interpretation. Some of the elements of it are things that people struggle with interpreting properly. So I think there was some lack of expertise. I know in speaking with most organizations, there's been a lack of budget. There's A, if we don't have the resources, B, if we need to implement some technologies like multi-factor authentication, or we need to migrate to a different email solution, those all cost dollars. If we need a SIM solution. I think the biggest reason really was a lack of understanding of risk and a lack of enforcement. The enforcement really being the case. So if you ask what's changed, really the only thing that's changed is now there's some enforcement, and that's what CMMC V2 L2 brings to the table.
That's such a really good point, because you just said 2016. Just about everybody has had this requirement since 2016. It's kind of amazing when you really think about that's what 6 years almost now that they've been required to do this, and now everybody's going, oh gosh, Chicken Little, the sky is falling. But it's been 6 years of this. But I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head. It's a big part of it is the lack of enforcement. I would believe. I mean, obviously budget and resources internally, but if I'm a small contractor and all I have to do is sign by the dotted line to say that everything's fine and nobody ever comes to check on me, I might be inclined to do that. It wouldn't be the best idea, but I can certainly understand why people end up in that mindset. So thank you so much, John. So Joe, do you have if you could explain to us sort of some of the types of CUI, like how would I understand CUI? If I'm someone who's got a government contract, it's got a 7012 clause, I have to be NIST 801.71, I have CUI. Okay, well, I've had a conversation with my core and my KO, and they go, well, yeah, you'll have CUI, at some point, and they can't really give me a good identifier. How are there ways that I could sort of help myself figure that out? If I'm sort of on my own, if you will.
So CUI control unclassified information, or CUI, is basically any information that you as a contractor for the government has created for the government, or the government has given to you to hold secure, right? So CUI basically is any information like PII, health information data, data on specific systems that are not classified by themselves, data that maybe the government wanted you to create for them, That's all CUI. And basically it might not, be clarified. Well, now it probably is clarified in contracts, but before, it wasn't. It was just created. And, the assumption was, hey, classify this stuff. Now it's basically, regulation that you need to control this information that has been created for government entities, right? So classified information, or sorry, unclassified information needs to be stored in places that, like, prior speaker said, on Amazon with encrypted information flows on encrypted drives, basically, things like that. And the reason why, it's so important that if you get a lot of this CUI, controlled unclassified information, together, it might become harmful if it's leaked out, to other adversaries and things like that. So it's not classified information, but if you get enough of it together, it might as well be. So that's why basically this is happening, the CMMC thing. And right now, 800-171, you have to adhere to that, or at least you have to say that you have done all your checks and things like that, to make sure that you say, hey, I say that all my CUI data is secure, right? So that basically that's CUI.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought that up, because it gives, you just gave a really good overview of what CUI is. And I think that'll help a lot of people, because I've certainly gotten that question a lot, where I don't know if I have CUI, how am I supposed to know? So that's a really good sort of indicator, like, okay, well, if this is something the government had me make, if this is something that the government gave me that could be in some way, like you said, if you could cobble pieces together and an adversary could attack with that information, then you probably have CUI and you should treat it as such. That's
So, yeah. And no, I will add this too. I don't mean to intentionally make it more complicated. So what we're talking about in general is there's different categories of CUI. There's the general CUI, but there are also different categories that have other additional handling requirements that under CMMC, you'll be expected to outline, if you're handling one of those special types of CUI, that you still have to meet those requirements. And when companies are trying to figure out what their CUI is, I kind of point it's helpful, not really great, but it is there. One, the CUI program, at least for all of government, is handled by NARA, right? So if you go to nara.gov and search for CUI, they give you a big category of all the different types of CUI that's possible, or how they've categorized it. DoD actually has one too. I think it's still dodcui.mil, and it does the same thing. They've taken all the various CUIs and categorize them and provide those special handling characteristics that need to be fulfilled if you are handling that specialized CUI as well.
Well, yeah, and thank you for that clarification. And actually, Tony, what kind of advice do you have for DIB companies that are looking to meet the 800-171 requirements to managing all of that CUI, making sure that it's safe and secure?
So my first thing is always recommending that they take a look at their data flows. They understand what the CUI is coming in and where is it flowing through within all your systems. And then also looking at, as Joe mentioned, if you're creating information or CUI in relation to those services you're providing to the government, and the government understands that is, well, whether the government agrees to, you treat that as CUI, right? So once you understand where all that information is, where it's being transmitted to and from, where it's being stored, where you're processing it, that's where you can create a boundary around your CUI environment, that authorization boundary that for a CMC assessment, a C3PL will need to understand, right? So when you look at that, then you kind of take that and figure out, can you consolidate and segment away from your rest of your environment? Because obviously we're all looking for people to be CMC certified when it happens, right? Obviously, the more you can scope and consolidate that down into a segment environment, the easier it's going to be to conduct that assessment, the faster it's going to be, the easier it is to apply those controls where those controls don't necessarily have to be applied across your entire corporate infrastructure. So that's always my first step of explaining to clients what they should be doing to prayer. to prepare.
That's a wonderful point. Scoping it down, you want to get it as small as you possibly can. That is such excellent advice. And to sort of piggyback onto that. So, okay, if you're starting the process, and I really can't even tell you how many times I've spoken to people who have contracts with the DoD that have a DFARS clause for 7019, which is the supplier requirements. So it's the SPRS requirements. Joe, how important do you think it is to have an accurate SPRS score if you're an organization seeking certification, or even just working with the government with the 7012 and 7019 clause?
That's a great question. That's a questions organizations should be asking themselves today, because once you start your self-assessment, you need to be able to say to the government, someone broke into my organization, I did all my checks, and if you can't confirm that you've done all those checks, then of course you're going to get in trouble, right? So that's kind of the main reason. The other reason is just basically to make sure that you're in regulation, doing the right thing, so that the adversary can't we can't say won't ever, but we'll have a harder time to get into the organization to get to that CUI. So that's basically it. The next thing is, of course, CMMC is coming up. So the same things that you're actually doing with your 171 and your self attestation is going to be CMMC. That's going to be regulation, right? So you're going to have to get checked and you're going to have to pass, right? So the same things that you're doing right now are going to help you in the future to pass that CMMC inspection.
Right. And having all that information, excuse me, accurately represented in the SPRS system, I assume that would be obviously really important. If I'm reporting all of my information in SPRS and I'm like, well, I think I'm mostly doing 1, 2, and 3. I'm kind of doing 3.1.2. I will just say that I'm doing the whole thing. How important do you think it is, especially considering that now we're in a situation where there are cores and KOs who are out there, evaluating people when there are contract modifications. We've got the DIBCAC is out there obviously doing voluntary assessments. We've even got the DOJ with the CCMFI coming out there doing cyber investigations of people and, paper audits and that sort of thing. How important do you think it is now? I mean, it's always important, but how much more important do you think it is now to have a really accurate representation of your SPRS score?
So, so basically, when it comes down to it, you want to make sure that you're doing the right thing. You're putting your right scores. You're making the right people look at your systems. Especially I would say, of course, if you are not comfortable doing that, then get a third party to come out. And the companies on here, the company that people have seen, for this whole all these sessions. Thank you, PreVeil, for coming out and bringing everyone together. But yeah, companies like PreVeil, get them out and get them to do your, help you with the self-assessment and just make sure you're doing the right thing. So yeah, that's the most important thing. And you have to remember, you're in business, with the government, you have to be able to take care of, government information, right?
Excellent point. Yeah, definitely. Because the last thing you want is for that to come back and bite you. Definitely. Thank you. And so for our last question, I'm gonna start it off with John, and then we'll all kind of talk, give all the panelists a chance to sort of chime in. But John, do you think that a DIB company needs to hire an outside advisor like what Joe was just talking about, like an RPO or some sort of consultant, in order to be successful with their compliance journey? Do you think that's a requirement?
Do I think it's a requirement? It depends on the organization. I mean, the answer is a requirement. No, of course not. It's NIST guidance is not rocket science or brain surgery, whatever you want to use to compare it. It's just a matter of what we talked about earlier. Does the organization have the resources, right? So that's bandwidth, time, and does the organization have the expertise? For the clients that come to Pivot Point to help them, Sherpa them through the journey, Clearly, the answer is no. They're lacking one or the other, right? They've got day jobs, or they've never really done this before, and they want to make, and the failure to achieve certification for an organization might be a very, very significant business risk. So the bigger that risk is, if you're generating 95% of your revenue through the DIB, then failure to achieve CMMC successfully could have a very significant impact on your organization. So that, I think, would be part of the business consideration on determining whether or not we should try to roll our own, or whether or not we'd be benefit by working with a third party that's got expertise and experience in doing exactly this.
Yeah. Joe, do you want to add anything on your thoughts and how you feel about, how vital is it to having a consultant in your organization through your journey?
So, of course, we've been on this panel, have been doing it for a long time. It's still a long process. Like I would say we're constantly going through it, but the process for us to get 171 compliant is still ongoing. It's a never-ending journey, and we're a company that does it, right? So I would suggest, if you have any doubts that you cannot or can't do the whole thing, get a third-party company to come out and help you, assist with either part of your assessment or the whole thing, right? So, and of course, you have to concentrate on your own business, right? So if you're not, kind of a cybersecurity company, or you don't have the cybersecurity personnel to do that, then I would suggest that, yes, 100% hire a company.
Definitely. No, I think that's wonderful advice. And Tony, did you want to add anything on your thoughts about the conversation of surrounding consulting and how important that is?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's just reiterating what John and Joe said, right? It depends on the needs of the company. Now, I will say, as a general rule, I say a good and qualified and experienced advisor consultant is a key success factor, especially for me coming on from the assessment side, where we would be the C3PO doing the assessment, right? With C3PO can't answer those questions for you. We have to maintain our independence and impartiality. What a good advisor consultant will do is help you, make sure you have the right documentation and the proof to provide to the assessor that demonstrates your compliance and implementation of those requirements and controls. What a good advisor too, that is especially experienced in DoD and federal, will be able to make sure that what you're writing, communicating, meets the expectations and understanding of the federal government reviewers, because at the end of the day, it's ultimately their decision call, right? So I can't count the number of times where we've been in discussions with companies and say, we implement X, Y, and Z. It makes sense, and we agree, it makes sense. But the way they've presented it to the government asks more and more questions, and they're just saying, it becomes a roadblock just because it doesn't meet the preconceived notions of the reviewer. And that's with anyone, whether it's government or federal or commercial or whoever. When you have a third body reviewing things, you're going to have to understand that you're going to have to meet their expectations, or at least address their assumptions clearly, to demonstrate that you're compliant with all those controls. And that's always a roadblock or a delay to the process. So a good advisor consultant that understands all of that pays off in dividends on the back end, where it just becomes a more of, you meet the expectations, you answer the questions, they're okay with it, and they move on, and you get your authorization or certification that much sooner. So it's not required, but it is a factor of success, or it can be.
So it's a good way of putting it. Yeah, please.
I was going to say one other data point, which is kind of interesting. I don't remember the exact number, but the DIBCAC recently did a review of all of the scores that people had put into SPRS. And the feedback that they provided was that the scores were grossly exaggerated, right? So people were scoring themselves well higher than they would actually have gone had they gone through a DIBCAC assessment. So I think that's a representative data point. And if you're management of an organization and you're making that determination on whether or not a third party is helpful or not, I think that's a data point that suggests that when people are self-implementing and self-assessing, they have a tendency to be more generous than they likely should be, which might get you into trouble when you get to the end game.
That's such an excellent point. And also to a point, yeah, such an excellent point. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because absolutely, I think that we all have that personal bias, even if we don't realize that we do. Also, just something, Tony, that you said about, how a hiring consultant can pay out dividends, just something for this, the last question where we have a couple minutes or a couple seconds before we're done. What is the average cost of a consultant that our audience should expect? And again, this is just a range. This is no quote from anybody, but what is the typical range that someone should expect to pay for, the sort of full-blown consulting experience?
I can say I can't answer that because we are an assessor. We don't provide advisory services.
Understandable. Well, then Tony's out.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to, like, as you might imagine, as the answer is with most things, it depends.
Right.
It depends on how much CUI, what type of CUI, is it CUI specified, CUI basic? Do they have ITAR data? How many locations are in play? How many scopes are in play? We're going to have multiple CUI enclaves. You also have to remember that, and one thing which is a really important point that none of us mentioned yet, is that it's not about being CMMC compliant or 801.71 compliant. It's about being DFARS compliant, right? And making sure that we're addressing the other clauses, clauses C through M, I believe it is, right? Like as an example in 7012. So it really depends on a bunch of things. I think it would be unlikely. And again, to Tony's point, getting an appropriately qualified and experienced set of consultants, I think would be unlikely for most organizations that you'd spend less than $30,000 or $40,000. And I think that for a very large organization, you might be talking about $100,000.
Gotcha.
But it really depends on how, and it also depends on where you are currently, like what the maturity of your environment is and where it really needs to go.
No, that's perfect. Yeah. I think it's important for everybody just to have at least a very pie in the sky understanding. Like you said, there's so many subtle nuances, as a part of that, but thank you guys so much. Tony, Joe, John, thank you so much for being with us. We're right at the 45-minute mark. Absolutely cannot tell you how much I've appreciated this conversation. It's been so informative, and I'm hoping that our audience found it informative as well. So thank you guys very much. Look forward to hopefully doing this with you again someday soon. And I'm going to move on to our final session today. Thank you guys again.
Great.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye now.